So I first encountered Matthew Kirby while he was presenting at a 2011, I believe, or 2012 WIFR conference, which is the Writing and Illustrating for Young Readers. And he was a pretty new author at that time, but the woman introducing him started out with this long list of accolades, and I just kept looking at him like, how old can he possibly be? He's only like graduated from BYU a couple of years ago. And as she finally finished, she was very enthusiastic, and she sat down, and I thought, he can't possibly be as good as all that. And he got up and he gave this amazing, very detailed, comprehensive talk about world building. And it was one of those talks that I had just kind of gone to because I felt like I should go to it since I write fiction and I should know about world building. But it was a fascinating talk, and I really enjoyed it, so much so that I came back to his next talk and even almost bought his book if I had $15 to actually spend at that time. But he brought to those talks, and he brings to his writing, which I have since then read, the same kind of realism, personal connection with an audience, and also a kind of magical comprehension of worlds beyond what he's actually showing you. To give you the long list of accolades so that you can look at him and be like, you can't possibly be this good, and then he can impress you. He's an award-winning author of middle grade novels such as Icefall, which I see he has up here, The Clockwork 3, The Lost Kingdom, and The Cave of Wonders. He has won the Edgar Allan Award for Best Juvenile Mystery and the PEN Center Use Award for Children's Literature, and the Judy Lopez Memorial Award. He has been named the New York Public Library's 100 Books for Reading and Sharing list and the ALA Best Fiction for Young Adults list. So will you please join me in welcoming Matthew Kirby.
Thank you. So am I close enough to this? Is this all right? It's really cool to be here. I actually see some very familiar faces in the audience. Some of my students from I never know where to say it. Wi-Fi or WIFR, the Writing and Illustrating for Young Readers workshop. And thanks to John for kind of proposing this idea of bringing me here, and Stephen Tuttle for making it happen. I'm really pleased. I thought today I would read from Icefall. It's it's the second novel that I had released. It's personal to me in a couple of different ways. The first has to do with craft and the experience of writing it. The character of Solveig, she is a princess in ancient Norway. I mean, the setting is not specifically hammered down in very formal detail. But as I was writing it, I kind of conceived of it as being ancient Norway, pre-Christian Norway. I had this dream one night, and I rarely ever remember my dreams, but this dream was vivid. And in the dream, there were 3 children, and they were standing kind of clustered together, clutching each other in the courtyard of a remote fortress. And the feeling of the dream is what really lingered for me, and it was this sense of claustrophobia, overwhelming claustrophobia, and bone-chilling cold. And I remember one of the things in the dream was there was snow in the air, but it was that kind of snow that doesn't really settle. It's just kind of it's almost more like icy dust that's just kind of floating around. And the ground was packed hard as cement. And these children were clutching each other, and they were terrified. And they were terrified because there was an army that was approaching from outside the walls. And in my dream, I never saw who the army was, but I knew they must have been pretty bad for the way these siblings were responding. But the way logic works in dreams, I knew that they were the good guys. Like this was not an enemy force that was approaching the walls. These were allies. And at that point, I woke up with that claustrophobia and that cold still sort of hanging around me and clinging to me. And at that point, I kind of had to answer a few questions. Who were those kids? What were they doing there? And the most compelling, why were they afraid of this army that was approaching if the army was the good guys? And so as I answered those questions, I met Solveig. And I'm not sort of generally mystical in the way I approach writing. I don't have a lot of use for some of the sort of vague writing is this mysterious process and you can either do it or you can't. I don't have a lot of use for that approach. I tend to be a really logical thinker and a rational thinker when it comes to writing too. But something happened that was inexplicable for me and remains so today. I sat down and I basically wrote the first 8 to 10 pages of Icefall. And that was the first thing I wrote on the book, and they remain the first pages of the book, almost word for word, as I wrote them the first time through. Solveig was a fully realized, living, breathing character, and I felt more like a conduit than the creator of her story. It freaked me out, to be perfectly honest. I put it aside. I was like, no, I wanted to do right by this person, and I didn't actually think that my ability was up to that. But my agent encouraged me to keep going with it. I sent it to him, and he said, there is something here. You need to keep going with this. And it came at a very interesting time because my first novel had come out, The Clockwork 3, and it had done quite well, and I was feeling sort of pressure that was never stated from my publisher. It was more internal than external, but I thought, I'm probably stupid to be writing something so different about this Viking princess. I should be writing something more like The Clockwork 3 to continue that success. But my agent was the one who said, if you let them, your publisher will turn you into this machine cranking out a middle grade fantasy adventure every year. And he said, this is your chance to kind of let them know that you're an artist. And I had never thought of myself as an artist, but that encouragement and that word from him is kind of what made me go back to Icefall. Turns out that those 3 children were the children of a king, a Viking chieftain. And they were sent to that fortress to keep them safe when their father went away to war. He had an enemy that he didn't want to be able to get to his children. And so they're in this remote fortress in a distant fjord, basically waiting for word from their father that it's safe to come home. And as protection, their father sends along a company of his fiercest berserker warriors. I don't know if you're familiar with berserkers, but in the Viking world, they were at times some of the most reviled characters out there. Modern scholars have kind of thought of them as a cult of Odin. They either used psychological trance methods or even chemical methods, psychoactive substances, to basically work themselves into a battle rage. And they were shock troops. They would charge into battle without any armor on, just screaming. And according to the legends, neither fire nor blade could touch them. But the legends also say that this battle rage could come on them unexpectedly at any moment. And so they were also known to sack their own villages if they got too bored. There was one story about this guy, this berserker who was pulling the plow instead of the ox. He was the one out in the field pulling the plow behind him, got all worked up, went into this battle rage. They called it the berserker gong. And he picked up the nearest poor farmer and dashed him against the ground and broke every bone in his body. So these are not the nicest guys to have around, which explains why those children in my dream were so scared. But there were periods of time where certain kings, Halfdan the Black, Harald Fairhair, they kind of welcomed the berserkers into their military machines and kind of used them and exploited their abilities as shock troops, and kind of legitimized them. And so that was kind of the era in which I set my book Icefall, and that's why the king sends his most elite warriors to keep his children safe should anything happen. And at that time, winter arrives in the novel, and it seals them in. The fjord is frozen, there's no sailing out, the mountain passes are frozen, there's no climbing out. They're basically stuck there until spring. And they realize that an assassin has been sealed in with them, a traitor. And they don't know who it is. It could be any one of them. And the story is really when it won the Edgar, it became a mystery with a capital M. Prior to that, my publisher didn't quite know exactly how to market it because there's a lot going on in terms of genre. But it's really a survival story, but mostly it's Solveig's story and how she comes into her own. As I turned in the first draft of it to my editor, really nervous, she loved it, and she was very surprised by it, but she got everyone else at Scholastic on board with it, and they were surprised by it, but I think ultimately that's been a good thing, because it's given me the freedom to kind of do, when I go to my editor and I say, I want to try something different, I've already sort of laid the groundwork for that, and they're like, okay, let's go with it. But the one thing she said after reading the first draft was, there's not enough backstory for the characters. That's partly because the book is written in first-person present tense. And that was a decision that was made, that was how those first 10 pages came out. So I knew, that's just the voice of the book. That's what the book needs. So it was difficult for me to kind of find a way to work the backstory in. It was very important that I not leave that claustrophobic setting. I felt like if I opened the world too much, it would, with other locations and other events, it would kind of lose that claustrophobia that was the essence of that dream I had that had inspired it in the first place. So I was trying to find a way to work in backstory without compromising that claustrophobic setting. And that was when I kind of stumbled across these vignettes that Solveig, in the first 2/3 of the book, between every chapter, there's this interstitial little kind of vignette where Solveig is talking to someone, one of the people that is trapped in the fjord with them in this fortress, and she's talking to them and basically telling a story. And as you go through the book, those stories eventually merge with the action of the story, the current action of the story, and you realize what you've been reading kind of throughout the first part of the novel. So I'm kind of going to read that part of it. And so I think it'll maybe give a sense of Solveig, and it'll also give a sense of the setting, the characters. And what I was really going for was this tension, kind of a slow burn that eventually just sort of explodes at the end. So the characters, there's Solveig, there's her brother, Harald, her older sister, Asa, and then there's Haka, who is the berserker captain. There's Bera and her son, Ruthie, who are servants to the king, his most trusted servants. And then there's Ulrich, who is the skald, the storyteller, to whom Solveig has actually kind of apprenticed. That's one of the driving themes of this book, is the power of storytelling and its formative effects on us. And at this time, the traitor has already struck, and basically in a stew of goat meat, poisoned and killed most of the berserkers. But a few people didn't partake of that meal, and so they're kind of the ones that are left. So this is that first interstitial thing. It seems so long ago now that Father ordered us to leave, so long since that early dawn when we boarded the ship under cover of darkness. We had so little time to prepare, but we took what we could, and Father chose carefully each man and woman he sent with us. Père, I think you were chosen because all of Father's men, he trusts you second only to Haka, and that trust extended to the men you brought with you, Gunnar and Egil. Bera, I think you were chosen because you have served so faithfully for so many years and proven your love for my family. The same can be said of you, Ola. Ruthie, I think Father chose you because he knows you have as much bravery, if not more, than did your brother, and he knows that you can be counted on when all others fail. And Haka, it is obvious why Father sent you after us with your men. If there is any warrior or force capable of protecting us, it would be you. Ulrich, you sit there silently, but I think you know Father better than anyone here, his mind and his will. In many ways better than his own children. I think that is why you were chosen. Aside from me and my siblings, that is everyone. And knowing that, I ask you, which of you did Father misjudge? The ice over the fjord is thinning. The dark water laps it away from below, rising closer to the surface in faint, shadowy ribbons against the white. So long as the ice holds, we are safe. No ship can enter. But it is thinning, and I do not know how much longer it will resist. Father will send someone soon, Harald says, to tell us that we can come home. That is the hope, Haka says. Come, we must return to the steading. Thank you for letting me look again, I say to Haka on the way back. The berserker captain nods. I think he is irritated with me. We still do not know who might have left the footprints by the runestone those months ago, who or what might be out in the woods, and even though we have all come to suspect that the enemy is one of us, Haka takes no chances. He insists on accompanying me to the cliff where I go each day to check the ice. Haka thinks, like Harold, that I am excited for the opening of the fjord, but I am not. We walk through the gate, now left unguarded most of the time, and Haka closes it. With the surviving berserker still weakened, there aren't enough men to hold the wall anyway if the steading were attacked. The hall is our only safety. We go inside for our day meal, porridge as it always is. I'm afraid to think about what I would trade for just a pat of butter and a drizzle of honey. I am sick of oats. After everyone has eaten, Ulrich pulls me aside. We should think about the story you shall tell your father. What do you mean? Well, I'm sure that you will tell him you want to be a skald. He'll want you to demonstrate your skill. He'll want to determine your aptitude for himself. I begin to panic. I can't. Not for him. You must. And you can. You just need to practice, and that's why I suggest we start now. No. I've been so consumed by the fear of my dream that I haven't been thinking about my father or what awaits me back home. I'm not ready. You need to be, Solveig. Winter is ending. You know it is. I shake my head. Just give me a few more days. He sighs. Just a few more days, I say. That's all. I promise. All right then, but this delay won't help you. Practice will. He shakes his head and walks away. A few days later, we are standing on the cliff, and the wind rushing up to us is warm enough to smell of the sea, and within a moment, Harald is jumping up and down. He points. I see it. An opening in the ice. A weeping seam. We'll go home now, won't we? Harald says. Haka lays his millstone hand on Harald's shoulder. Not until we're sent for. Your father will wait until he is certain of your safety. But his messengers will be able to reach us now, Harald says. That is true. Something knots up and sinks in my stomach, like a boiling stone dropped in the kettle. I turn away from the cliff. Come, Harald. Haka raises an eyebrow at me. What's wrong? Harald says. Aren't you happy, Solveig? No. I am frightened, but I won't tell him that. I'm tired. It's been a long winter. It has, Haka says. Let's go inside. Once we've reached the hall, Harald tells everyone that the ice has broken, which prompts cheering and laughter, everyone except Ulrich and me. The skald makes eye contact with me from across the room. Later that night, he asks if I am ready to begin preparing. Whether I am or not, I made a promise. Let's begin, I say. Good. First, we must select the story. Now, your father prefers the newer tales, nothing too old. He connects better with heroes of recent memory. I nod. He will also have just fought and, I trust, won a war, so something celebratory would probably endear you to him. It is odd to think of my father in this way, as an audience. I have never paid attention to the particular songs and stories he has chosen. In this regard, he is a stranger to me, and Ulrich knows him better than I do, his own daughter. At that thought, a deep inadequacy pulls my gaze to the ground. Ulrich continues, we should consider telling a tale about your father, to honor him. We need to do what we can to help your case. My case? Sir, you make it sound like a trial during the thing. It is a trial in a manner of speaking. You are making a claim that will require evidence and witnesses. I will speak for you and recommend your talent, but you must supply the proof that you can do this. He pauses. You must believe your own case, Solveig. If you doubt yourself, how can you expect your father to do any different? Do you believe? I look up. I want to believe. That will have to suffice for now. For the next few hours, we discuss potential tales. Some I have never heard before, and Ulrich tells them quickly, touching on the important details. But then we turn to the events of my father's own life, stories already told of him, again and again, so that I already know them by heart. Isn't there something that hasn't been told before, I ask? Perhaps, Ulrich taps his chin, perhaps it is time to... Time to what? He looks at me with a sly smile. In fact, it might be the perfect time. Perfect time for what? A tale of your father before he was king. Do you know how he became the king he is today? My father has been king for as long as I or even Asa have lived. I have never known him as anything else, and when I try to think of him as something else, my thoughts fail. But he was once a warrior like Per. I've heard the story of how he fought for another king who died in battle, and even as his fellow warriors fled, my father charged and defeated the enemy chieftain in single combat, claiming both crowns as his own. Tell me, I say. Your father was not of noble birth. He was the son of a fisherman, but he left to become a warrior. It is said that as a young man he was vain and filled with dragon fire. This was in the days before he mastered his temper and became the man you know. There was a time when he would fight any and all at the slightest insult. He left no challenge unmet, and let no injury to his pride pass unpunished. He was wild and feared. I think of my father so silent and immovable. How can a stone be wild? And then one day your father was walking down a road in a fine new cloak he had won in a bet. A rider galloped by him and splattered him with mud. Your father became enraged and shouted a challenge after the man. The rider turned and trotted back. Peace, son, the rider said. Let me buy you a new cloak. But your father would not hear him. He demanded single combat, and the rider obliged. But when the rider dismounted and removed his cloak, your father saw an old man covered in battle scars. He wore no armor. A berserker? I ask. Yes. When your father saw his opponent's age, he smirked, thinking this would be an easy victory. But when they began to fight with spears and swords and axes, your father realized that this old man still had strength in his bones. Their bodies and boots carved ruts in the road. Their battle lasted a day and a night until dawn came, and shocked and exhausted, your father fell at last. But the berserker did not kill him. You are a mighty man, the berserker said, but you could be mightier still if you overcome your fear. I fear nothing, your father shouted. You fear the beast that is inside you, the berserker said. You are afraid that if you challenge it, you will fail. So you fight with me instead. Your father spat. Stop talking and finish this. I'm not going to kill you, the berserker said, though that might be the easier road. But no, I am going to train you. I have no wish to be a berserker, your father said. Do you wish to be a king? The berserker asked. Because you have it in you to become one, and I can lead you there. He offered your father his hand, and after a long moment, your father took it. They traveled together for several years, and your father passed through 3 trials, each a tale in its own right. I am rapt by Ulrich's story. The image of my father shifts in my mind like a cloud with each of Ulrich's wind words. My feelings for my father have been unseated, and I do not yet know where they will settle. Ulrich continues. First, your father fought the fearsome Haugbui of a fallen champion that had been tormenting its own village, sending the bloated corpse back into the grave. Hold on. Then he turned a great bear, a man-killer, or he hunted a great bear, a man-killer, deep into its cave. Their battle shook the mountain by its roots, and the bear's pelt was large enough to cover 4 benches in the mead hall. And finally, your father fell in love with your mother and served her father for years to prove his worth and earn the right to marry her. Along the way, He learned the berserker ways. He learned the prayers that quiet the beast inside. He learned the chants that rouse the beast to a frenzy before going to war. And in those years, your father fought the hardest battle of his life, but mastered himself in the end. The rest of the story I think you know. The tale has left me breathless. And what about the old berserker? Berserkers are not so honored in other kingdoms and chieftains. In many places, they are exiles, reviled and feared, but your father gave them a place of honor. He appointed them as his elite guard in tribute to the man he had met, fought, and learned from. It is a wonderful tale, and I know that Ulrich has already gilded it with myth metal. Beneath the firelight reflected in the ornamentation, I can almost see the ordinary truth. I wonder why Ulrich would go to the effort now, for me, his only audience. And then I know. It's about fear. My father has always seemed immune to fear, but now I know that it is something to be mastered, not denied. I know what you're doing, I say. Whatever do you mean? He asks, his eyebrows up. In my fear, you ask me to tell a tale about overcoming fear. He laughs. I didn't think to fool you, only to surprise you. I nod. It is a good tale, and I will tell it. It is a good tale. And my father will enjoy it? Ulrich nods. I trust that he will, so long as he even lets me tell it. Several days later, I stand at the cliff, staring at the widening gaps in the ice, willing them to narrow and close. A ship could enter now, something Harald reminds us of daily as he shoots about the hall, flying like an ember popped from the hearth fire. He wishes we were leaving this place today, but we are not, though I wish we were as well, even with the dread I feel when I think about returning home. Each day we remain in this place is another opportunity for my dream to emerge from the bed closet into daylight. Below me, down by the water, Ola fishes, alone. Haka wanted to go with him, but the old man insisted he could take care of himself and that no enemy would be interested in a worthless old thrall anyway. So he casts his line and his net by himself. I'm too far away to know if he's having any luck, but my mouth waters at the thought of eating fresh fish tonight. Later that evening, Ola brings in a line of glistening fish. Some of us gasp and others laugh. Bera, Ruthie, and I clean them, saving the offal to fertilize the garden plot in back. Then we slap them down on flat cooking rocks among the embers. First, the fish release their briny steam, and then their eyes shrivel above their open mouths, and then their skins begin to crackle and brown, and I don't remember ever getting so much pleasure from watching something cook. Soon we are all peeling and eating the crispy skin, flaking off chunks of the moist meat with our hands. I feed some to Munin. He's a raven that Haka gave her, a pet raven. And he snatches the morsels from my fingers as though he is as tired of oats as I am. Harald and I smile at each other, grease-fingered, and suck on the bones. We add them to the offal for the soil, and Bera plops down on the bench with a sigh. Tomorrow, she says, I think that I shall begin to pack up our things. Per turns to her. Pack up? To go home, she says. We are not leaving, Per says. We're staying here. And with that, Joy, our brief guest, leaves us. Why would we stay here, Bera asks. Per is right, Haka says. We have no news of the war, and even when a messenger arrives, they might not bring welcome tidings. This is ridiculous, Bera says. I see no reason to stay in this place any longer. The fjord is open, the sea is calm. It is the perfect time. And what if the king's children are still in danger, Haka asks. You would risk their safety for your own sake? Of course not, Bera says. But do you really think they're safe here? Perhaps you need to go take another look in the cowshed. That's where they've piled the dead berserker warriors. Haka explodes. Don't you dare speak of my men in such a way. Why are you so keen to keep us here? Ola asks Haka. The berserker looks at the thrall and then away. Stick to fishing, slave. It would seem to me, Ola says, that you must have a reason. Are you leaving some work here unfinished, perhaps? Haka laughs. Such as? But Ola does not need to say it. He is accusing Haka of being the traitor. I look at the berserker, and I remember his night prayer. I know he didn't do it, for I have seen his heart. But the others haven't, and by the wariness on their faces, I can see that Ola's words have trailed doubt into the hall after them like a cold breeze. I agree with Haka, Per says. Of course you do, Ola says, and then he looks at Asa. Why would you want to go back to your king's hall? Per lunges. You forget yourself, and he backhands Ola. The old man tumbles over his bench. I cover my mouth, shocked. Ola struggles up, rubbing the side of his face. Ola speaks the truth, Bera says. It could have been you, Per. Me? Per looks like he is about to strike her as well. You accuse me? You're the one who cooked that cursed goat. That brings Ruthie to his feet. How dare you? Per's hand goes to the hilt of his sword, and Bera gasps. Harold starts to cry, and the shouting rises to a roar, accusations filling the air like arrows. It is finally too much. We have fractured under the strain and are undone. It wasn't the hunger that broke us. It wasn't the meat from my Hilda, nor the death that ravaged us. Suspicion is a different kind of poison, a potent toxin of whispers and air. We're all infected, and it will be our end. In the next moment, I know someone will be hurt. I cannot allow it. I must do something, and so I rise to my feet. Listen to me, I cry, for I have many stories to tell. The hall falls silent. Everyone stares. All of you. We cannot let this enemy divide us. We cannot let our suspicions and our doubts run wild, or else we will destroy ourselves. Brave and honorable men have died, and it is true that there may yet be a traitor among us. But if there is, we hasten his purpose if we turn on one another. I look around the room at the faces of the people I love. We cannot forget who we are, I say, who we were. If you ever listen to me, hearken to me now, for I would remind you. And then this goes back to the interstitial chapters, and this is the final of those stories she's been telling all along. Have you listened? Do you still wonder at the meaning of these stories and my reasons for telling them? One of us is a traitor, one of you. I accept that possibility only because the signs all say I must, but it rends my heart, and that is why I cannot bring myself to accuse any of you. After all that I know of you, after all I have seen and loved in each of you, how can I? Who shall I name murderer among you? Per? Bera or Ruthie? Ola? Haka? My own brother or sister? To believe it is possible about any one of you is to believe the stars will die. To accuse any one of you is to slay the stars myself. And so I ask you, which of you or which of us can you accuse without bringing down the walls of this household? Who can you suspect without poisoning your heart toward the rest? To suspect one is to suspect all. Stop this now. I know that evil hides here, but I cannot be the one to uncover it. Neither can any of you. Time will do that for us. And how I fear that day. For I know that when I look into my betrayer's face, I will see someone I thought I knew, and I will still love them. Sorry. I haven't read that in a long time, actually. And her story still has the same impact on me that it did when I was writing it. But if you guys have any questions now, I'll stop the reading there. And I think we have 15, 20 minutes for questions. And don't worry, like a 9-year-old took all the pressure off of asking the most awesome question possible. I was doing a school visit, and he raised his hand and he said, "How did you get so cool?" And I love that kid. So yeah, that question's already been asked. You don't have to worry about that one. Any other questions? About anything. I mean, it doesn't have to be about the book or the writing. It could be about publishing. How many here are like aspiring writers yourselves? Wow, almost all of you. Okay, cool. Well, open forum. Any questions? Yes?
There's a lull. I noticed that in a lot of your books, you tie it pretty closely to logic and what's actually happening in the world, but you also include allusions to magic and sometimes even actual magic. How do you make the decision for where to bring that in and how to?
There's usually a variety of reasons. Ultimately, if I'm putting something that has a fantastical or speculative quality to it, I'm doing so because in some way it serves the narrative. I think everything is in service to the story. The plot is in service to the story. Any twists, elements, magic, all of that, it's all in service to the story and should reflect on that in some way. So primarily that's my first concern, but there are some things that are just cool. And I try to make them serve some function. But in my newest novel that came out in October, The Lost Kingdom, it's a colonial American fantasy. And I had, the premise is that the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia in 1753, it's actually, it's a period of silence for the society. John Bartram and Ben Franklin founded it 7 years prior, and then it had fallen into inactivity by 1753, and it would come back later kind of as the organization that still exists today. But in that kind of gap, I kind of gave a secret mission to the society, which was to go into the wilderness and find the lost kingdom of Prince Madoc, who, according to legend, was a Welsh prince who in 1170 sailed from Wales and settled a kingdom in the New World. And it was a widespread and pervasive belief among the American colonists that somewhere out there was a kingdom of his descendants. And that belief persisted up until Thomas Jefferson told Lewis and Clark to be on the lookout for them. So I have, on the eve of the French and Indian War, I have the American Philosophical Society venturing out to find this kingdom to gain allies, because everyone is pretty convinced that at some point over the Ohio country, we're going to go to war with France. So after I'd introduced that element, I started looking at other beliefs of the American colonists. And another widespread belief was that somewhere out there are mammoths and mastodons. The religious worldview at the time wouldn't allow for a god that would let one of his creatures go extinct. So they find the bones of mammoths and mastodons. They therefore conclude that somewhere out in the frontier there are mammoths and mastodons. As with Madoc, I took that belief at face value. And they encounter, the Philosophical Society, as they're traveling, encounter a group of Native American hunters on taking down a mastodon. That was a fantasy element that I did it, it does serve the story, but it doesn't serve the story in the same way other elements do. It was there primarily to build that world and to create this sort of alternate America. So there are all kinds of reasons for including fantasy stuff. Usually I'm trying to do it consciously. I'm not trying to just sort of throw stuff in willy-nilly. Like, it's got to have a purpose, I guess. Any other questions? Yes?
You said when you were writing Icefall that the point of view and the tenets just kind of happened for you.
Yeah.
How do you typically go about determining what point of view to write from?
They asked me to repeat the questions. The question was in Icefall, that particular point of view, the first person present tense. He asked how I go about determining which point of view to use for a story. Again, that's kind of a choice that I make sure is serving the narrative at the prose level. So even though Solveig's voice emerged that way from the beginning, I wasn't necessarily thinking it would stay that way. It's kind of it can be an awkward tense to read and an awkward tense to write, that first person present tense. However, I realized that that's the most claustrophobic point of view that you can take. Like, there's no one else, there's just the main character, so we're not really seeing anyone else except through that lens. And with present tense, there's no future. Like that, a present tense narrator can die. And it's not cheating to do that because there is no future. So when I kind of thought about it more rationally, even though that was sort of what had instinctively arisen in the prose, when I thought about it from a rational, logical point of view, it still made sense to keep that. With The Clockwork 3, there are 3 protagonists, and there's a tremendous amount of serendipity in that book, with comings and goings and meetings, and their stories kind of interlock. That's where the title comes from, The Clockwork Three. There's these three kids and their stories come together. And I kind of felt like it needed a rather removed third person in order to get the reader to accept that. It almost had to have sort of a fairy tale quality about it, and fairy tales are told with that omniscient third. I didn't go with omniscient, but I did want sort of a removed third, because I thought it would help young readers keep track of the three storylines, to be somewhat removed from it, but also I thought it would make some of the more unbelievable elements more believable. The Lost Kingdom, I had 3 or 4 false starts. And it wasn't until I switched to first person before it was like, okay, this is what this book needs to be told in. And that wasn't as much a rational or conscious decision, just as it was paying attention to whether the book was working and coming along. When I was starting in third person with that book, I kept feeling like I was, just slugging through mud, like it just wasn't coming. But when I switched to first person, it just took off running. So that was confirmation for me that that was the voice that book wanted to be told in. So it just kind of varies. It's usually trying to figure out, what does this story need? Because you can do a lot with that prose. Like, I think that a lot of the claustrophobia that's in Icefall is, at an unconscious level, it's because that voice is so constricting. But I don't know if that answers your question, but yes.
Often it seems we privilege character-driven stories over plot and the creation of world. But you seem to try and strike a balance between, like you were talking earlier, the cool fantasy elements and the actual character-driven stories. Do you feel that is a just hierarchy there, or would you modify that?
So the question was basically about the priority or the primacy that's given to voice, or not voice, but character or plot in terms of what's more important. And do I believe in that hierarchy? No, I actually think that's a false dichotomy. I don't think character serves plot, and I don't think plot serves character. I think they both serve story. And I differentiate between story and plot. Story is, it's something that we are innately born to do. It's how we organize the world. Our memories are basically stories that we tell ourselves about our own experience. Because we're all born storytellers, that's innate to us. I just think that's a universal instinct. Plot focuses the meaning of a story by imposing structure on it. Someone has, I can't remember who said it, an artist said that the essence of the painting is the frame. And I think that's true with story too. I think that story needs some kind of structure to contain it and help us find the meaning in it. It's like that E.M. Forster story, the king died and then the queen died. And plot is the king died and then the queen died of grief. You've basically done something that has imposed a structure, and it's given meaning to the events that you've described. Otherwise, it's just a narrative of events without the plot to come in and frame it with a beginning and an end, and help the reader see the meaning in that narrative. So when it comes to character or plot, you need both, and I think you need both equally. They're both in service to that larger storytelling instinct that we all are born with. Any other questions? Yes?
Where do you come across the legends that you've incorporated, and do you have any advice for finding your own sorts of inspiration?
Where do I come across the legends that I incorporate? Well, I tend to be somewhat, highly distractible. It usually comes about through just, I watch the weird documentaries on the History Channel, that like, I did my undergraduate work in history, so I kind of laugh when I look at some of the programming that's on the History Channel right now. It's really not history, but it's wildly entertaining. And kind of the crazier, the better. And a lot of times you'll just come across this stuff that you're like, what? But there's so much storytelling potential there. So I like to read weird books that catch my eye. So I used to, when I was at Utah State, I did not go to BYU, actually. No, that's fine. But I went to Utah State, and I used to actually just go wandering among the stacks, and I would just look for books with weird titles and stuff. And there was this one book that I saw one day that was called Little Slaves of the Harp. I was like, what is that? And so I pulled it down, and I opened it up, and on the first page was the story about this kid named Joseph back in 1873. And there was enough on the page that really intrigued me. I had to find out more about this kid, and it had mentioned that his story was printed in the New York Times. So I went online, went back through their archives, and actually pulled up the original stories that were published in 1873 about this kid Joseph, who had been kidnapped from his home in Italy, and he had been brought over to the United States, to New York City, where he was forced to play music on the street to earn money. I mean, it's very Dickensian. And he had this ruthless master named Vincenzo Moto, his padrone, who would beat him and starve him if he didn't bring enough money home. Joseph had a scar on his ear where this guy Vincenzo Moto had almost bitten it off. And he had threatened to kill Joseph if he ever tried to escape. But there was one night where Joseph did just that. He mustered his courage, I can't imagine, and he fled to the one place in New York City that reminded him of home, which was Central Park. And he wandered around the park for a few days until he was found half-starved by this park keeper named Dennis. And Dennis kind of shared his lunch with him and realized this kid's in trouble. So he took him to a woman who anybody here been to Central Park in New York? There's this building there now that's known as the Dairy. Back in 1873, it was a working dairy, and this woman, Mrs. McMonigal, ran it. And she took Joseph in, and she fed him, and she clothed him, and she protected him, because by this time, Vincenzo Moto's thugs were out hunting for him. But a New York Times reporter got wind of this kid and went down to the park and interviewed him and published his story. And there was so much public outcry about it, because the fact is, what Vincenzo Moto was doing was perfectly legal. It was a system of child slavery that was typically Italian children who were either bought or stolen. And between Paris and London and New York and Chicago, there were thousands of kids in Joseph's exact circumstance. But the public outcry was such after the publication of these articles that they arrested Vincenzo Moto. And this kid, Joseph, who would have been Giuseppe back in Italy, he took the stand and testified. And he was all of 12 by this point. So when I read that story, I was like, okay, this kid's got to be in a book. And so the Clockwork 3, the character of Giuseppe is directly inspired by Joseph. And that just came about because there was a weird title on a book, and I just pulled it off the shelf. So I don't know, I'm just always kind of on the lookout, and always, if something tickles, I'm like, pursue it. Because a lot of times you'll find something there. Many times you won't, but a lot of times you will, and that's usually how it happens for me. Any other questions? Yes, Chris. Oh yeah, so I have a new series starting up, and again, this was like, I went to my editor and said, okay, I want to do something really different. She's like, okay. I said, I want to do a crime saga. A middle grade crime saga with magic. Only it's not going to be magic. I'm going to explain it with quantum physics. Okay. And fortunately, like I said, I think I've set the tone with them, and Scholastic at this point is just like, okay, let's do it. So the first book in that series, The Quantum League, actually comes out on Tuesday. If you guys want to come up, I'm doing an event up at the King's English in Salt Lake, the 28th at 7 p.m. I'm going to do a demonstration of quantum mechanics that will involve a cat. So those of you laughing know what I'm referring to. But yeah, that was a really fun book to write. It's a lot faster. There's lots of twists and turns. The first novel is a heist novel. So it's like Harry Potter meets Ocean's 11, because you've got these kids who realize that there is this magical world out there. Like I said, it's explained in the word magic isn't used in the book, It keeps it grounded in bastardized science. But it does work to do that. So the first novel is a heist novel with like heist crews and gangs, and the Quantum League is this police organization that's out to stop them. The second book that I'm writing right now is a mafia novel. It's the same characters, but it's kind of working its way through this crime saga. The third novel is going to be the cat and mouse Moriarty criminal mastermind sort of conclusion, where they find out who the bad guy has been all along and they try and hunt him down. So that's going to be that trilogy that starts up in a couple of days. But yeah, come if you want to see quantum mechanics with a cat. King's English, Tuesday, 7 p.m. Any other questions? Are we out of, what time is it? Oh, we've got like 5 minutes. So maybe one or two more questions. Yes? My editor, I'm so lucky. Like, and I didn't have anything to do with it. It was my agent. He knew her, and he knew she'd like it, and he was right. I mean, Scholastic made an offer on The Clockwork 3, and they'd had the manuscript for 5 days when they made a preemptive offer on it. So, I mean, that is the importance of an agent. Like, I didn't know who she was. She's not terribly extroverted. She doesn't get out to many conferences that I'd gone to. I hadn't come across her name at all. But it turns out I couldn't have a better editor. Both professionally and personally. She and I have become really good friends. Whenever I go to New York, I always go over to her house and have dinner with her family, and it's a wonderful working relationship, both personally and professionally. But you know, I have to credit my agent with that entirely. Any other questions? Yes. What's that? How did I get my agent? It was actually at the Writing and Illustrating for Young Readers workshop that used to be here on campus, and now it's held at the Waterford School. My agent is Stephen Fraser, and he was there, and we had a sit down, and he read 20 pages of The Clockwork 3 or something like that. It wasn't finished yet. No, I take that back. He was actually reading, what I brought to that conference where I first met him was the first draft of what became The Lost Kingdom, that is now my 4th book. He read the first 20 pages of that, and he send me this when you're done. So I did, and he passed on it. I think his exact words were, "It's good, but it's not great." And he told me to put it aside and write something new. And that was not what I wanted to hear. I mean, if it's not great, let's make it great. What can I do to fix this? But he wasn't even going there with the manuscript. He said, put it aside and write something new. So I decided to trust him, and I did that, and I wrote The Clockwork 3. And I sent that to him, and he said, we can sell this. And then a couple years later, he said, that book you first sent me, there's still something there. Why don't you go back to that? And so I did, and it's a very different book now. The Lost Kingdom is a very different book than what I submitted to him that first time. But he's a different kind of agent, too, because we were maintaining contact, and he was really nurturing me along for about 1.5 years without signing me. There aren't many agents that do that anymore. But, and he's been an amazing agent for a lot of reasons. Like, I think he just sort of intuits what I need to do. And I don't often think to do that he's asking for. So when he suggests put the book aside, I mean, that caught me off guard. And then once again, when it came to writing Icefall, he was saying, you need to write this book. And actually, because of Icefall, Donna Bray at Balzer and Bray with HarperCollins, she read Icefall, and because of Icefall, she approached me to write a trilogy for her that will be starting up next year. So because my agent encouraged me to write that book in the first place, it's now led to, and that's really what agents can do, is like sort of guide your career and nurture that. And at very critical junctures, he's been right there and he's told me to do the exact right thing. Yep. Yeah, once I had Clockwork 3, that's when he said, all right, now we need to sign this and make this kind of an official, formal agent-author relationship and get this book a home. So maybe one more quick question? Or not? Yeah.
I guess I was just wondering, did you always think that you were going to be a writer? Like, did you feel like that was your calling, or how did that come about?
I've known I wanted to be a writer since I was about 12 or 13. And this question actually brings us full circle, okay? So when I was 12 or 13, my parents gave me A Wizard of Earthsea for Christmas. And reading that book, I knew I wanted to be a writer. Like, completely transformative experience. Down to one sentence and one word. In the Wizard of Earthsea, there's this moment where Ged, the main character, is kind of performing some very forbidden, very powerful, dangerous magic, and he opens up this rift into another dimension. And through it comes this thing. And Ursula K. Le Guin described it as a clot of black shadow. And I don't know why, but at the age I was at and reading that, it stopped me in my tracks. Like, the way that was phrased, I realized that every single one of those words had been carefully chosen with purpose. She intended those words, and that woke me up to the fact, wait a minute. There's a writer behind every book doing that same thing. And suddenly it was like, that's what I want to do. Like, that's what I have to do. And that's one of the other reasons. I said there were two reasons why Icefall was so fulfilling for me. It's because there was actually a blurb from Ursula K. Le Guin on it that my editor got without telling me. But she knew what Ursula K. Le Guin meant to me, so I think she was trying to protect me in case Ms. Le Guin said no, or in case she read it and said no, which would be far worse. So I wanted to write since I was that age. At various times, I've given it up and then picked it back up because I couldn't leave it alone. When I went to the Writing Illustrated for Young Readers workshop and met Steve, I was at the point of walking away. I was working as a school psychologist. That's what I had got my degree in. And I was like, I mean, the money isn't great. I'm going to have to go back for my PhD. Like, the writing thing just isn't panning out. I need to do something here. And so I was on the verge of sort of like quitting for good and going back to school. And I think that probably would have been, for a very long time, that would have been fatal to any writing that I was doing. But because I met Steve and I got that encouragement from him, I stayed with it. But yeah, like when I was in grad school the first time, I put writing aside for 2 years. I just didn't have the bandwidth to, I was always watching for weird stuff and ideas, but I wasn't actively writing. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, how my own writing impulse kind of formed and became what it is. But thank you very much for having me. I think that's all the time we have, and I guess there's going to be a signing afterward, and so if you want to come chat some more, feel free. But thank you.